Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to begin our presentation today. This is the ISO 9001-2015 Critical Points of Review during the Transition Audit Process. My name is Joseph Krolikowski, and I'm the Technical Director of Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of technical notes here. Everyone is on mute, but we definitely want to take your questions. Please utilize the questions portion of the dashboard, and at the end of the presentation we'll go over the questions and answer every single one of them for you. Our topics for today, we're going to review how the transition to ISO 9001-2015 is going to be handled. We'll address the additional amount of audit time that will likely be needed. We've got an extensive section on new audit content. We'll review a summary on how an audit to ISO 9001-2015 is going to differ from ISO 9001-2008. I'll have some concluding statements, and then, as promised, we will definitely take your questions. Beginning first with how the transition will be handled. Our plan is to offer three potential approaches that an existing client can use to complete a transition from 9001-2008 to 9001-2015. Now, our intent with this is to enable you to do a transition pretty much at any point you desire, depending on your strategic plan and perhaps the needs of your customers and other interested parties. The preferred approach, of course, is to transition as part of a recertification audit. The recertification audit, of course, already includes additional audit time and obviously also includes issuance of a new certificate. However, we do recognize that for some of our clients it's going to be necessary to transition as part of a surveillance audit. And so we will be offering transition services during both annual surveillance audits and semi-annual surveillance audits. Now, in the annual surveillance audit, you'll have a small amount of additional audit time. This is going to vary from case to case. In semi-annual surveillance audits, if you wish, you can split the additional audit time up between two consecutive audits. Now, they do have to be consecutive audits. However, you can also opt for all of the additional audit time to be performed in a single step. And this is actually PJR's preference as well, that the transition process be done in a single step, whether it is a recertification audit, an annual surveillance audit, or a semi-annual surveillance audit. Now, in the case of a transition being done as part of a surveillance audit, what you would receive is a cert revision. So, for example, let's say that you had a recertification audit in January of this year. You have, of course, you're going to be receiving a certificate that bears a September 2018 expiration, owing to the fact, of course, that the 9001-2008 standard expires in September of 2018. When you have your transition audit on a surveillance in this case, your new certificate would have an R1 extension, meaning revision 1, and the cert expiry would be 3 years out. In this case, in the case of this example, it would be January 2019. So that is how that will be handled. And again, our intent is to meet the needs of our clients, whatever they happen to be, and whenever the timing is best for them. Now, in terms of the projected amount of additional audit time that's going to be needed, we've prepared a special grid for internal use to calculate the amount of additional audit time that's needed. Now, the full measure of detail is considered confidential. However, we can confirm a couple of critical details. Most average-sized companies, if they choose to do a transition over a surveillance audit, will be looking at an additional half day of audit time to complete their transition process. Most companies, if they choose to do it over a recertification, will be looking at no added audit time at all. Now, further information on this is available through your PGR scheduler or sales representative. If you're an existing client, we do have a special memorandum that we've prepared that we can absolutely provide to you that lays out all of the particulars on how this will be handled. Now, the primary purpose of my presentation today is to go over the new content, the new items from the standard that are going to require verification during the transition audit process. Let's begin our review in Section 4. Now, Section 4 is called Context, and there are two crucial ideas that are raised in Section 4. And we've got a couple of slides that are dedicated to these ideas. Has the organization implemented a process to determine, monitor, and review external and internal issues that are relevant to the purpose and strategic direction? Now, first of all, I'll point out that last term there, strategic direction. Keep that term in mind. We're going to be giving that term some discussion in a few slides. Let's start with the phrase external and internal issues. There's a couple of intentions with how that's been worded. First of all, the fact that we're talking about external and internal. Part of what they wanted to promote with the new version of the standard was the whole idea that yes, customers are important. Customers are certainly a big part of why we have a quality system in the first place, but they are not the only parties at play in the success or failure of a quality system. So taking this much broader idea of external and internal issues and how does that relate to the purpose of the organization and the strategic direction that it takes. Now, in terms of how this will be audited, how this will be approached, this is obviously a very high-level quality system establishment activity, most likely to be ascertained through interviews with the leadership of the organization. Now, in 4.2, we introduce the other kind of critical idea here, and that is the phrase interested parties. And what is an interested party? And of course, we go over this in some more depth in the other webinar that I have, but to refresh everybody, interested parties are thought of as anybody that has an impact on your quality system. And again, the emphasis here is that these parties are going to be both external, folks like customers and suppliers, and internal, employees within the organization, departments, unions, and so forth. The intent here is that as a leadership team, as an organization, you are cognizant of who your interested parties are, and furthermore, aware of the external and internal issues that are raised by those interested parties. And that's going to be an item that's going to be discussed with leadership, and we're going to be looking for evidence of that in a few other places, and I'll be pointing those out as we come to them. Now, 4.2 continues. This is kind of the extension of that idea. Does the organization have a process to monitor and review information about the interested parties and identify what their requirements are? And obviously, there's a lot of ways that you can communicate with external parties. You think about the contractual process that you might have with your customers, or the processes that you have in place for communicating with your suppliers. One of the more interesting ideas with interested parties is the whole aspect of trade groups and legal authorities and the kinds of requirements that might flow down from them? How do you keep yourself informed on what is changing from a statutory or regulatory standpoint that you need to be aware of? Does this mean that you're visiting regulatory websites, or that you sign up for industry emails, or that you attend trade shows and things of this nature? These are all ways that you can keep yourself informed. You just need to be prepared to explain the methodologies that you're using to your auditors. That's a big part of the expectation here is, do you as an organization, do you have your hands around what your approach is and how this will work? Another item taken from Section 4 has to do with the scope statement. Is the scope statement appropriate and accurate? Does it take into account these external and internal issues and feedback from the interested parties? Does it reflect the products and services of the organization? In terms of what PJR has specifically done for this, we've actually tweaked a question in our audit workbook. We've always had a question for a scope statement, but we've now tweaked it to ask our auditors to ascertain, is it an adequate scope statement? Does it reflect the things that it needs to? So obviously, for many of you, your scope statements are long established and no doubt meet all of this criteria, but our auditors will now be asked to assess this specifically. Also from 4.3, kind of an interesting idea here. Exemption can now be sought for any requirement from the standard, not just those related to product realization. The standard has eliminated the term permissible exclusions, and it's been replaced with the concept of non-applicable clauses. That's actually the verbiage that's used in the standard itself. Not applicable, not apply. And the expectation here in terms of implementation, a very similar approach to what you would have done under permissible exclusions. Obviously, there is no longer a quality manual required. However, you certainly can use a quality manual to identify what your exemptions are. In terms of this whole idea that the entire standard is now up for grabs for exemption, our analysis really has shown that the majority of likely exemptions are going to come from Sections 7 and primarily from Section 8. Within Section 7, for example, this is where we find the requirements pertaining to measurement equipment control. So if, for example, a company has no measurement equipment, they would exclude or claim a non-applicable for that particular clause. Just about everything else that makes sense as an exemption comes from Section 8. This is where we find design. This is where we find what we've called special processes for a long time, and so forth. Now, you might make the argument, well, okay, if I don't think that management review meetings pertain to me, just to go with kind of an extreme example, I'll exempt it and still be acceptable. Well, again, the idea is that we are going to assess you against the requirements of the standard that apply, and you cannot exempt something and just because you don't want to do it. That part of it has not changed. If it's a case of you don't have that item within your system, so again, measurement equipment design and so forth, that will be acceptable. So again, the likely acceptable exemptions are going to be those coming from Section 7 and 8. Turning our attention then to Section 5, we have kind of an interesting item here under 511A, and that is the idea of accountability. And Section 5, as I'm sure you have learned, is called leadership, and that term leadership is deliberate. The whole idea of we lead our system, we lead by involvement, we lead by example, And this clause really kind of hammers that home. Has management, has leadership demonstrated that it is accountable for the effectiveness of the quality management system? We've tweaked our workbook a bit to direct our auditors to ascertain, is the leadership team involved? Are they participants in management review? Are they participants in corrective action and so forth? And furthermore, as we're going to learn a little bit later, we expect the leadership team to be able to speak with some authority on these topics. We expect them to be able to explain what management review is all about, what corrective action is all about, and not just defer to the quality manager. Again, the whole idea is that the leadership team has to lead. They have to take responsibility for the effectiveness of their system. That's why this term accountability is such an important term. Has management ensured that the quality policy and objectives are compatible with the strategic direction of the company? So as promised, let's take a few minutes now and talk about this term, strategic direction. Interestingly, it's not a term that's been defined, at least not in an official capacity, within either ISO 9001 or ISO 9000. So the best we have to go with is a general consensus. So PJR reached out to people that we know within the industry, including people that participated in the writing of the standard. And the consensus that we reached was that strategic direction relates to the organization's vision of where they want to be. Using the term mission, vision, these are two terms that are used to lend clarity to this idea. And the intent is that a quality system, and in particular the goals that are associated with the quality system, should contribute to the achievement of the larger mission of the organization. So how are we going to assess this? Well, we're going to be looking at management review, we're going to be talking to leadership, we're going to be talking to employees, and we're going to see, okay, where is the organization now, and do they have a strategic direction? Do they have a vision for where things are going? Again, if you have a long-term goal, this lends some clarity and some purpose to the goals that have been established. We don't just have goals for the sake of having them. We have them because they're part of what we want to achieve long-term, part of our strategic direction. So that's what that term is understood to mean. Has management assured that the quality management system requirements have been integrated into business processes? A little bit of clarity here. For many years now, really since ISO 9001 was first published, the accounting department and things related to accounting were always considered hands-off. And for the most part, that's still the case. We're not going to be digging into ledgers, we're not going to be digging into balance sheets and so forth. How this requirement is going to manifest is in a couple of ways. You think about the fact that business processes use documents. So we would apply revision control to those documents. Obviously, business processes involve the retention of records. Well, ISO 9001 specifies practices to follow for keeping records, so that would apply. Business processes use people, obviously, and we would expect that you have steps that you've taken to assure the competency of those people. So again, are we going to be digging into the books themselves? No, but we're going to look to see that some of the more global practices that are associated with ISO 9001 that these are being applied to the business processes just as they are to the quality processes. Has the organization ensured that the quality policy is available to all relevant interested parties? Now, really, if you take a close look at Clause 5.3 from ISO 9001-2008, this was what was intended all along. You know, the quality policy was always viewed as kind of a guiding star and something that was promoted both within and outside of the organization. They've made this a bit more pronounced here, and they've said, okay, all relevant interested parties. This includes employees, but it also includes external interested parties. So how do we do this? There's a number of ways that you can promote your quality policy to the outside interested parties. You can talk about posting it on your website. You can put it in your front entryway. There's a lot of ways that this can be accomplished so that it is available to the relevant interested parties. Has top management taken on the responsibility for management of the system? Now, this was formerly the purview of the management representative. And actually, all mention of a management representative has been eliminated from this standard. So we talked a little bit earlier under 511A about has leadership made itself accountable for the effectiveness of the quality management system. This is a further manifestation of that requirement. And again, I've already kind of made my point on this, but the larger idea here is that the days of an organization dumping their quality system into one person's lap, those days are supposed to be over. And really, that was never the intent of the management representative. It was always viewed as somebody that would be somewhat empowered by leadership. Leadership would work hand in hand with this person to coordinate what was needed for the quality system. But in too many cases, what happened was a single person was given the task and they had all of the responsibility placed on them. So the framers of the standard, the TC 176 committee, decided that it was necessary to put some stronger language in the standard and to completely eliminate all mention of management representative. Now, in terms of some of the practical aspects, it's been said that it's okay to have a key contact. It's absolutely okay to have somebody that takes the phone call when an external auditor calls, or to call the meeting to order when it's time to have the management review meeting and so forth. But again, who's responsible for this quality system? Leadership. This is the intent behind this particular change. Has top management established a means to monitor if processes are delivering their intended outputs? Now, this particular item is not so new. It's very, very similar to clauses within 9001-2008, but it's just unique enough that it bears mentioning. Now, obviously, process effectiveness has long been associated with KPIs, quality objectives, and so forth. And is management actively involved in the monitoring of those items? If you're monitoring your KPIs and objectives, and KPI, by the way, stands for Key Performance Indicator or Key Process Indicator. If management is involved in the monitoring of those items, they are going to be monitoring their processes by default in most cases. Turning our attention then to Section 6. Obviously in Section 6 we have the most direct representation of the new risk requirement. It's been stated many, many times and written into the annex to the 9001 standard itself that a formal process for risk management is not required. Nevertheless, as an organization, you're going to be expected to be able to explain how your organization has approached risk and determining what the applicable risks and opportunities are within your system. Now, in my other presentation, Preparing for a Successful Transition, we identified some of the strategies that you can use from 9001-2008 to approach risk. So let's revisit a couple of those ideas. Obviously, preventive action is going to factor. Management review is going to factor. Contractual review is going to factor. There's a lot of ways that an organization can identify risks and opportunities that are relevant to the quality system. As an organization, you simply need to be prepared to explain how it works for you. Now, once you've identified the risks and opportunities, how do you then deploy the action that you're going to take? And again, what the auditors will be looking for is nothing specific, but just for an explanation and a demonstration of how it works for your company. So again, same stuff, potentially preventive action, potentially management review, potentially the contractual review process. Whatever set of processes makes sense for you to approach this requirement that you can explain effectively, that's what you should go with. And I do want to emphasize here that with risk and risk management and risk-based thinking, bear in mind that a variety of approaches is encouraged here. Again, the larger idea is that risk management and risk-based thinking is something that impacts the quality system at large. It's not a single activity that's done by itself. It's a collection of activities that work together to help the organization achieve a larger mission of managing risk within its processes. That's kind of the big picture with what that requirement is all about. In Section 6, we also have the requirements for quality objectives. There's been a little bit of clarity that's been added to quality objectives. First of all, in 621, are quality objectives relevant to the conformity of products? And do they enhance customer satisfaction? Now, I would say for the majority of organizations out there, this is going to be the case already. The existing quality objectives that organizations have are already relevant to conformity of products and enhancement of customer satisfaction. Now, there have been companies that I've personally worked with in the past where, for example, they have safety objectives or they have business growth objectives, profit margin objectives and things of this nature. Those objectives don't necessarily match up with this ideal. However, this does not mean that those types of objectives are to be discarded out of hand. What it means is that if you choose to have an objective that's rooted in safety, if you choose to have an objective that's rooted in profit, in addition to those objectives, you need to be prepared to have some other objectives that relate to product conformity and or customer satisfaction. So if you have an objective that's rooted in safety, for example, you're not going to receive a nonconformance under 621 if you can demonstrate that you have a sufficient bevy of objectives that this requirement is being upheld. Now, in addition to that, under 622, we have some other items that are mentioned. And these include that objectives have to be analyzed to assign resources, and to identify who's responsible, to establish a timeline, and determine how they will be evaluated. Now, again, as to how we're going to approach this from an audit perspective, the same way we have for many years. We audit quality objectives within the context of our audit report. Now, for you, this may mean that you have to tweak a bit how you present your objectives. There's a lot of companies out there, for example, that use quality objectives tables. That's absolutely fine if it meets this criteria in terms of all of this being analyzed. Some companies choose to do it within the context of their management review meeting. That's also fine, again, if these items are being addressed. So whatever method you've been using up to this point, take a look at it in relation to this enhanced set of requirements. Turning our attention then to Section 7, we have a couple of slides here on the topic of organizational knowledge. And we start with this statement: has a process been established to ensure that organizational knowledge is maintained and made available? Organizational knowledge is kind of an interesting idea. Think of organizational knowledge as knowledge that is specific to the organization, that is gained through experience. And the means of sharing that knowledge is going to vary just a bit. But some of the heavy hitters here are going to be things like training methods, documentation, right? You know, we use work instructions, we use production controls, and enhanced quality controls. So you think about if you have a tenured employee, somebody that has been with you for 25 years and knows all the ins and outs of running a particular process, how do you capture what that person knows in such a way that it can be flowed down to the other people that are going to do that process? So that's kind of the larger picture here. Now, additionally, with organizational knowledge, there's the idea that we learn from past mistakes and try to improve the processes. This is also obviously risk-based thinking. Now, so what happens when we have a mistake? Well, oftentimes we have corrective action. We have a customer complaint. So those disciplines will factor here. Certainly competency disciplines will factor. Production planning even will factor. You know, learning from past mistakes, ensuring that necessary organizational knowledge is retained in such a way that it can be shared. Now, in addition to learning and gaining knowledge through experience, the other half of organizational knowledge is, are you ready for what's coming? And that's where this phrase, changing needs and trends, factors in. Has a process been established to assess competencies against changing needs and trends? And so, you know, as an organization, you know, again, think about strategic direction. Where are we going? What's our vision? Is our staff ready for what's coming? That's another kind of risk management, risk-based thinking idea here. And so do you as an organization then assess where we are now and where we're going and how to plan for meeting those competency needs in the future when they come up? So that's another part of this. And obviously, in terms of how we audit this, we already have long-established methods for reviewing competency. We look at it within management review. We look at it within training records and so forth. And like so much of the rest of what we've looked at, what we're hoping for here is that you can speak confidently on what your organization's approach to this has been. Couple of items then from Section 8. We'll begin with 833D. This is one of two clauses where there's been some additional input added to design. If you are responsible for the design of products, do the design inputs include standards or codes of practice that you have committed to implement? Now, in terms of how this will be audited, this will be audited no differently than how we've approached design in the past. Most auditors, they'll sit down with people in the design department, they'll pull design projects, look at records and so forth. This item is very, very similar to the existing requirement that statutory and regulatory inputs be considered in a design project. In fact, I think this is intended to lend some clarity to the somewhat ambiguous statutory and regulatory requirement. Now, additionally, as an input, you are asked, have you as an organization considered potential consequences of failure due to the nature of products or services? Now, again, current audit methods for this will be employed. This requirement is looking at a few things, safety, financial fallout, recalls. Now, obviously, this is going to be very heavily dependent on what it is you're designing. If you're designing an end-user product, you will need to consider these items. Is this an item that, once it's used up, it's gone, a consumable, or is there an end-of-life item with this consideration that I need to make? Is there a warranty aspect that I need to consider in the design of this product, and so forth? If, on the other hand, what you're designing is one piece of a 500-piece assembly, well, you may not have the benefit of considering all of the potential consequences of failure. You can consider how your part failing might impact the larger assembly, but again, you're handicapped a bit by your part in the process. So obviously the auditors will be taking that into consideration during the review of design projects. Also in Section 8, we have some new requirements that pertain to external providers. Has the organization established a method to control and monitor external provider performance, and more specifically, to communicate their intentions on the control and monitoring of external provider performance? So how do you make external providers aware of how you're going to control and monitor them? And really, you can point to the existing methods for communicating with suppliers and communicating with external providers. So what are the current methods? Well, obviously purchase orders, contracts, terms and conditions found on websites, and so forth. They're all to be considered possible approaches to how this information is communicated. The idea is that it is something that's provided to the external providers, and indeed that you as an organization monitor external provider performance. Have controls been established for external provider property where ownership does not transfer to the organization? Now, this is a kind of an interesting added item for what was formerly known as customer property. Now, I think we're all quite familiar with the customer property requirement from ISO 9001-2008, the whole idea that if you have external property that belongs to your customer, gauges, raw materials, and so forth, that if those items are lost or damaged, you have to keep a record of it and advise your customer. That requirement has now been rolled out for external provider property. And there's a number of different ways that this might manifest. For example, let's say that as an organization you have a process that you want to install for powder coat painting. And because there's a large cost associated with this, you set up an arrangement with a company that's going to set up a paint booth for you and keep you stocked with paint. And all of this is on a lease agreement. Well, if it's on a lease agreement, that means that that paint booth doesn't belong to you. It belongs to your supplier, to your subcontractor. So if it's damaged, if you have issues with it, you need to have a process in place to record the incident and communicate that incident to the supplier or subcontractor in question. Under 855, there's been some expansion on the requirements for post-delivery activity. Among other things, you're asked to consider now, are there applicable aspects of warranty and so forth. And so if you have a product where there are certain post-delivery activities that are going to occur, warranty, recycling, final disposal, and so forth, have you established controls for those items? Now, our sense is that this requirement is going to be somewhat limited in applicability. Our existing methods of assessing contracts and planning processes and so forth will be the likely approach taken for assessing the controls therein. Has the organization determined a process for responding to unplanned changes in such a way that conformity with requirements is maintained? Now, 856 is a simple section that's called control of changes. And essentially, the larger idea here is that there's changes that are planned, and then there are changes that are unplanned. And changes that are planned, typically, there's going to be methods in place for recording what those changes are. That might be captured within management review, within planning meetings, and so forth. If you have an unplanned change, how do you capture that? So again, there's a few disciplines that you can bring to bear to meet this requirement. You think about corrective action. If you have something that you weren't planning to change, maybe it's due to a complaint, maybe it's due to an internal nonconformance, and so there's a possibility that you'd be using your corrective action process to capture that and to facilitate the response to it. That then continues on the other half of this. Do we have a way to retain documented information about changes, including who authorized the change and the actions arising from the change? And again, if it's unplanned, maybe we're talking about corrective actions and customer complaint resolution. If, on the other hand, it's a planned change, we would look to perhaps things like management review, planning meetings, operational memos, things of this nature. Turning then to Section 9, there's a handful of new requirements that pertain to the management review meeting. We're actually going to go through each of these in short order, and then we'll have some comments. Management review is now to include a discussion of internal and external issue changes, including the effect on the strategic direction of the company. Now, we talked about internal and external issues and strategic direction a bit earlier in the presentation. We can now see that this is required input to the management review process. Has management review been structured in such a way that it includes discussion of external provider performance? We mentioned earlier that you're required to monitor external providers, and now we're saying that you have to be sure that you're talking about external providers within management review. Lastly, does management review include an assessment of risk management actions? So these new items together, represented by these clauses, in terms of how we're going to assess these, we already have a fairly structured approach to reviewing management review. We have a question within our audit report. We have instructed our auditors to be cognizant of these new items. So the methodology for a management review meeting is unchanged. You know, there are companies out there that like to do a single management review meeting a year, hit every topic, and kind of be done with it. That's going to continue to be acceptable. We have companies out there that choose to do a couple of topics at a time, to have smaller mini meetings. As long as everything is discussed, that will continue to be acceptable as well. That's the end of the new clauses. Let's turn our attention now to just an overview on how will the audit to 2015 feel different from the audit to 2008. Now, for the most part, the differences are going to be minimal. The differences are going to be quite manageable. We've highlighted some of the bigger ones here: risk-based thinking, previously required documentation, the role of leadership, and so forth. Let's dig into these items a bit more. Let's start with the discussion with the leadership team. We have placed some additional emphasis on the role of leadership within the quality management system. And we've added some targeted questions in our audit report that the auditors will be expected to ask the management team. Now, you'll note that I say team here, not just a single individual. Again, the idea is that this is a leadership team. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the audit report also directs our auditors to ensure that leadership is directly involved in the management of the system. So one of the ways that the audit is going to feel a bit different is that there's going to be a dedicated session to where the auditor is meeting with the leadership team and going over these questions. Now, we're anticipating that depending on the extent of the responses, this interview may take anywhere from 20 to 45 minutes. It might be briefer than that. It might be longer than that. It's going to depend on the responses that are given by the leadership team and any follow-up that comes as a result of those responses. The 9001-2015 audit obviously also includes a targeted review of risk management. Now, we've said over and over again that you don't have to have a formal process for risk management, but we are going to be asking you, what is your approach? And again, you need to be able to explain to your auditor how you've approached the requirement and what is it that you're doing to meet this requirement. And as I said earlier, the intent is that this is something that is system-wide. So it's not a case of a single process that you hang your hat on for risk management. This needs to be a multi-layered approach, a multi-pronged approach, and something that you can point to various disciplines and say, this is what we're doing to approach risk management and risk-based thinking. Now, obviously, this audit under 2015 means no more preconceived expectations for documentation. We no longer have any requirements for procedures or a quality manual, meaning that we cannot demand that you produce these items for the audit process. However, if you choose to have a procedure for one or more topics, if you choose to have a quality manual, the content of that procedure, the content of that quality manual is still subject to audit. It's still considered admissible as audit criteria. So does this mean that you need to get rid of your procedures? Certainly not. If they are used as part of your system, I'd say it's far better to retain them. But bear in mind that just because the standard doesn't require them anymore doesn't mean that we can't refer to them and hold you accountable to what they stipulate. Now, in addition to the new requirements being brought in by 9001-2015, we do have one interesting new item coming from 17021, 2015, and that is the assessment of statutory and regulatory requirements. We've actually added a question to our audit workbook specifically for this topic, and we're directing our auditors to inquire about it and ascertain the applicability. Now, in terms of how the audit is going to feel the same, the key aspect of the 9001-2015 audits will be the same as it was under ISO 9001-2008, and that is that we audit your processes. Element-based audits have been obsolete for over 15 years. Our transition to process audits was complete over 13 years ago. We audit your processes, and it's up to you to decide what your processes are. And the auditing methods are going to be the same. We're still going to be observing activity. We're still going to be reviewing documented information. We're still going to be talking to people. All of the things that we do to learn about your process, review points of evidence about your process, none of that changes. We still expect you to demonstrate that the requirements of the standard have been addressed through the processes that you have established. PJR is ready to ensure that your organization has a smooth transition to 9001-2015, and we're confident that for the majority of our clients this is going to be a smooth process and that you will feel there has been some benefits that have come from your transition to the new standard. I do invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have ISO 9001-2015, Preparing for a Successful Transition. It's delivered once a month. It's an overview of the development of the standard. We have an update on the timeline. We look at the format and layout of the standard, and we have some common questions that are answered in that presentation. Also, the interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. This is also shown once a month, and it explores the crucial topic of processes and how to correctly understand them. We do like to keep in touch with our clients and prospective clients, and so we do invite you to visit our website at www.pjr.com. At the bottom of the page, you can input your email address in the provided space and click subscribe. And by doing so, you'll be automatically opted in for future updates. We send out notice on webinars. We send out notices on updates to the standards. A lot of helpful information to be shared by you opting in. I do thank you for your time. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and grab the question dashboard here and see if we have any questions today. I'll be glad to answer them for you. Don Dayton asks, is today's information available online? Absolutely, Don. We do make all of our previous recorded webinars available for viewing at any time. There's also some information that you can input to get the slides. We're glad to make both available to you. Any other questions I can answer today? Raul Vasquez asks, a lot of thanks, you're quite welcome. It's clear that auditors will see, observe in the process audit, absolutely. The intent is that you audit processes, very much. Lori Lester asks, I'm wondering if we do webinars on AS 9100. Lori, I don't personally, but I'd certainly be glad to inquire on that on your behalf. Chandru Idnani, I do hope I'm pronouncing that right, asks, how detailed will the risk management be? Well, bear in mind that risk management is not intended to be a one-size-fits-all from company to company. Our intent is that the auditor is going to come in and ask the question, what are you doing to approach this requirement? So really the emphasis is on you as an organization being able to explain, okay, here's what we're doing to approach this requirement. Here's how we incorporate risk-based thinking or risk management into our processes. So whether that's preventive action and management review and contract review and so forth, that's what you need to be prepared to explain. We have incorporated a rather straightforward question into our audit report that triggers the auditor to ask, but in terms of what you present, that's going to be at your discretion and depending on the needs of your organization. Edward Weiss asks, what about FEMA for risk? A great question. I would say that if your organization has an understanding of FEMA and uses FEMA, that can certainly be part of a larger strategy for risk. But bear in mind that FEMA, in its purest form, strictly relates to the production process. FEMA is an assessment of what are the risks that are inherent everywhere from receiving to shipping. The idea with risk management as it's presented in 9001 2015 is how do you incorporate risk-based thinking into the processes of your system? So if there's a way to incorporate the FEMA methodology into a more system-wide strategy, absolutely that can work. So, bear those points in mind. Liliana Nunez, again, hope I'm saying that right. How deep do we need to understand ISO 17021:2015? Is it already available for review? It is available for purchase. However, 17021 is a standard that is applied to certification bodies. That's the standard that PJR has to abide by. So certainly it's available to you to review if you're so inclined, but it's not a standard that you necessarily have to be intimately familiar with. I'm getting some very nice comments on the presentation. It's my pleasure to present it. I'm glad it was helpful. Gary Mishkin asks, we are ISO 1345 certified. In your opinion, are many of the new requirements consistent with existing requirements for 1345? Certainly some of them are, Gary. Again, interestingly, risk management, as it's presented in ISO 1345 and the support standard, ISO 14971, it's presented from a product perspective, and the whole idea that what risks to the patient, to the healthcare industry, exist from the medical device that you are manufacturing. So again, that's part of it, but remember that risk management as it's viewed in 9001:2015 is more system-wide. Chelsea Johnson asks, how do we get access to the 9001:2015 manual? I believe you mean standard. Chelsea, it's available for purchase in a few places, www.iso.org, www.asq.org. Those are two places that you could start for getting access to the standard itself. John Rodriguez asks, if there's no requirement for documentation, where do you define non-applicable clauses? Well, John, again, that's up to you. If you choose to do so within the context of a quality manual, you can certainly do it that way. If you wish to define it in an operational procedure, that's fine. On your company database, that's also fine. But it needs to be available for review during an audit. Charles Ozenbaugh asks, are intellectual property and financial information examples of customer property? Absolutely. Intellectual property, especially if we're speaking of part prints and manufacturing methods and other points of information such as that, absolutely that would constitute customer property. Any other questions I can answer today? Okay, well, I'll wish everyone a good day and thank you for your time.